Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion will be part 3 of an ongoing series dealing with software updates. Specifically, part 3, we're talking about the server side of software updates and diving deeply on how the server side components work. Really, what we're trying to do is line up the configurations that we've done in the console and understand how those configurations translate to action in the ConfigMgr environment, in the hierarchy, and also we'll look at some database tables and so on. So what we're specifically doing here on the server side is trying to take the process all the way up through creating policy for clients to take action. So that's going to be our dividing line, and where we'll end today is creating policy that clients can then access to know what to do with the software updates that we've configured in the console. So here's a bit of the agenda that I want to use. So we'll talk about some definitions first to kind of get us started off right, and then we'll review some hierarchy information, look at some software updates as they relate to the hierarchy, some flow, look at delivering software update policy. So again, we're interested on the server side in preparing policy, so also known as deployments for clients. So we'll take a look at how that works. Finally, we'll turn some focus to the database and understand how the configurations in the console actually translate to the database. Not exhaustive, can't go exhaustive, but to give you an idea about what's going on in the database, some key markers and so on. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion about software update status and a few interesting nuances there. So let's start off with some definitions. Specifically, the term configuration item. So this is a term that you might have heard in several different corners talking about different aspects of Configuration Manager. The point here, configuration items definitely play very significantly in software updates, but configuration items really, the base engine for that is compliance settings. So software updates and application management and even OSD in some places and other areas, just a few other areas, actually make use of configuration items as their driver, as one of their key components. But compliance settings is the base engine that provides all of that. So software updates, application management actually bolt on top of the compliance settings engine, specialize it even more, but at the base it's all configuration items really, and the way we evaluate configuration items is the same basically across those different technologies. So that's important to understand, right? We won't talk about compliance settings in this discussion, but if you do understand compliance settings, it just is a boost up to understanding some of these other roles and features, if you will, in Configuration Manager. Okay, so specifically in software updates world, we have a few things that we talk about that are pivotal to configuring software updates. The first, obviously, is the software update, right? The software updates, as you work with them in the console, all of those software updates ultimately are configuration items. That's what they are, right? Configuration item, the definition of it, just not to be silly here, but it's an item that describes configuration that you want to manipulate in some way, that you want to evaluate in some way. Certainly true with software updates. Software updates either are going to be compliant or they're not. They're going to be required or they're not, right? They're going to be installed or they're not. So configuration items define the parameters around that, and the engine for software updates will check that on the client side. That's client side, so we'll save that for later, right? Software update groups, another key component of software updates in Configuration Manager. It by itself is a configuration item. So here, software update groups actually are containers that will point to a number of different software updates, but the group itself is evaluated for compliance as a whole. The group is a configuration item just as much as a software update is. And there's some implications of the fact this software update group is a configuration item. So I'll mention it here, and I'll also mention it in a bit. So you may or may not have ever noticed, but when you're in the console, if you're doing maintenance, so routine maintenance on a software update group, for example, would be removing expired patches, expired updates from a group, or moving from a monthly software update group, moving updates to a longer-term yearly software update group or something like that. That's routine maintenance. It's very normal to do, expected to do, whatever. What you may have noticed, if you look at the status of the software update group after you do that a few minutes later, 20 minutes later, however long it takes, all of the status will have rolled to unknown. So you might have had 98% of your environment compliant, 2% non-compliant, whatever. Whenever you make a change to the software update group membership, all of that resets to unknown, which seems a bit puzzling at first, but when you factor in that this is a configuration item like anything else, and configuration items have to be evaluated to no detail, no results, it kind of makes sense. Whenever you make an addition to the software update group, now we have a different set of parameters that we need to evaluate. So we will go do that, and your status will report back in and come back to normal, right? Factoring in that update. But at least temporarily, it's going to go to an unknown status as we reset the group and begin the evaluation process again. So bear that in mind. Again, I'll mention it a little bit later as well, but factor that in. Another thing that I mentioned here is the actual update source file. So this would be the CAB files or the executables or the MSPs that you actually have that make up a software update. Those items are configuration items as well. So one thing to think about, why would we actually have our source files, and it's not just software updates, it's any source files for advertisements, for applications, for packages, for whatever, are configuration items in ConfigMgr 2012. Why would we do that? Well, I'll leave you with that question, and I'll try to remember as I go along to answer that as we come back. Well, in fact, I'll answer it now just so I don't forget to do it, and I'll probably say it again. The whole reason we treat, well, not the whole reason, but at least one key reason we treat content source files and we code them in as configuration items. Certainly the source files are out there and accessible and downloaded by the client, but the reason we code them into the database as configuration items, at least in part, is because of the new validation mechanism we have on our distribution points. In order to validate content, we kind of have to know what the content should be. So we store those details in the database in the configuration items tables so that we can reference them whenever we're doing the validation of our DPs. And there's some other things too, but at least that's one. Okay. Now, all this talk about configuration items, you're hopefully getting a sense that understanding the configuration item is really important and what it looks like and how to identify it and so on. Well, in the console, you're not going to notice, it's not going to by default call out and show you this is a configuration item. But there are some places in the console where you can go to expose that. So let's pull in the console. I'll just show you a couple of things real fast that you'll want to at least know about whenever you're looking at software updates and trying to trace them. So under the software updates node, the first place we'll stop is all software updates. Now, in the All Software Updates list, you can scroll over left to right, look at the column headers, and you're not going to find anything in here that really refers to a configuration item. In fact, in this console, you're not going to see anything that says configuration item here. But in fact, all software updates are configuration items, and the one way you can easily track it down is to look at the unique update ID. So I've pulled that in. So every software update has a unique update ID that you should be able to find in the database. All right. So we'll look at that a little bit later on, and I'll show you how you can track that unique ID back to the configuration item ID in the database. And what's interesting is the unique ID here. So the whole reason you care about the unique ID or the configuration item ID is when you're trying to trace this on the client, those items are going to be what you see in the logs. It's very rare, it happens, but it's very rare that you're going to actually see the long name, the user-friendly name of the update or whatever as it's trying to process. But you'll see all over the place the unique update ID or the configuration item ID. Again, I'll show that to you whenever we get to the database here in a bit. But just to be clear, the unique update ID is not the CI ID, but it enables you in the database to find the CI ID. Okay, and another thing, so if we go to software update groups, so I mentioned these are configuration items just like anything else. Well, here we actually see configuration item unique ID, and we get our first glimpse into the format of our configuration item ID. I always call this a GUID. It's not a GUID, but it reminds me of a GUID, so that's why I say that. But the format of this, you're always going to start with a scope ID, and then after the slash, you're going to see an identifier followed by another ID. In this case, we know it's an auth list, an authorization list configuration item. There are different kinds of configuration items. There's ones for software updates specific. There's ones for content. There's ones for couple of different ones for compliance settings, OSD, whatever. I'll show you the various kinds of configuration items when we get to the database in a bit more detail. But for now, this kind of being able to ferret out the IDs here is important. Another thing you'll see, for example, is the configuration item ID itself. Well, this is important too. Every configuration item is going to have a unique configuration item ID that, again, you can tag in the database and be able to kind of line things up. And all of this detail that I'm showing, by the way, do you need to know it to administer ConfigMgr day by day? No. The reason that we show this is because, in my mind, it helps to understand how the product works, to be able to explain and predict and configure things better if you know how it works behind the scenes, and if you educate yourself as to what some of these components actually are and how they play, right? So that's really the theme of this, not that on an ongoing basis to administer this thing you need to even factor some of these things in, but certainly for troubleshooting, understanding the flow, and so on, it's important. Okay, so let me leave this for a minute. And these, by the way, the deployment packages, these are all the content anyway, are configuration items. Okay, and I'll show you how you can ferret that out in the database as well as we get into the database later on in the discussion. All right, so let me pull the lab out for now, and we'll continue on. Okay. So in terms of hierarchies and software updates, there's just a few things I want to cover here. The first thing is just talking about the different site types, right? Certainly we've talked about this before, but when it comes to understanding the functional differences of how these sites go, it really comes into play when you are trying to understand how information flows through the hierarchy, through the site, to make actions take place. So for example, the CAS. The CAS is the central administration site. By definition, a CAS cannot manage clients. Well, we know that a CAS can't be chosen to directly host clients. You can't assign a client to the CAS. But it actually goes beyond that. If you've looked at it, you know that there's no management point role on the CAS. There's no distribution point role on the CAS. The reason why is the CAS doesn't manage clients. There's no point of having a management point or distribution point role on the CAS. Well, if you look deeper, it's actually beyond that. There are no client management components on the CAS. Common components that you would expect to see on a primary site, including a central site, back in ConfigMgr 2007, would be things like offer manager, collection evaluator, policy provider, right? Others. Those do not exist at the CAS. So while you can absolutely build software update groups, deploy software updates just fine with a console that's connected to the CAS, all of that work of actually doing the deployment, building policy, and so on, that actually is handed off to a child primary site. And the child primary site does the work, and I'll show you that as we go along, right? The primary site, just hand in hand with the discussion, is the one that does all client management. Primary sites are the only kind of site that you can assign a client to. Correspondingly, the client management components, such as the ones we just mentioned, offer manager, collection evaluator, policy provider, etc., all are there. They aren't at the CAS, right? So if you start looking at logs, as I oftentimes do, and get confused by looking at the CAS logs, expecting some client log to be there or some primary site log to be there, it's not there. And it's just the nature of the CAS versus the primary. Secondary sites, we've talked about at length in different presentations, really aren't the same animal as they were in previous versions, meaning they're really not required. There's very, very limited scenarios in which a secondary site really is necessary. People still use them. They're really not necessary. In many cases, right, there are very corner cases where they are. But if you do need to use a secondary site, one of the things that most often means is that you're in a very low bandwidth scenario, very unreliable bandwidth WAN link scenario, perhaps, right? In those scenarios, you need things like a management point or a distribution point local. That's why on a secondary site now we require you to install a management point and distribution point local. You can't have a secondary site without a local management point and distribution point. In the same way, if you're going to be installing software updates, you're very likely going to want a local WSUS server, or a local software update point. So factor that in as well. But again, secondary sites, while they can actually offer services to clients that are within their boundaries, they cannot be the recipient of clients being assigned directly to them. The assignment is always at the primary site, right? That's just rehashing some of the basics, but it's important to understand how all of this fits together. All right, so let's just flip through the slides and we'll talk about some of the rest of these things. I want to talk about in review the WSUS software update point synchronization process. WSUS software update point, same thing. We talked about that before, but I want to review it and just show a couple of things, or one thing really, about it in addition to what we talked about. Talk about triggering synchronization in the console. We'll also detail the software update replication process, which I want to review, and then tracking some of the synchronization. But let's just move forward. So in terms of software update synchronization, software update point synchronization, I'm not going to dive into the weeds on this because we did cover this a bit in a previous session. But this is a diagram that I used in a previous session that just simply illustrates the general process by which software update information is synchronized. So you'll have the CAS in this case make a request to the software update point WSUS server. The software update point will go retrieve data, typically from either Microsoft Updates or, as of SP1, an on-premise WSUS server chosen for that purpose, or you can even export and import it manually if you wanted to. Once we get that information to the local software update point, we'll synchronize that back into the database of the CAS. Well, once it's in the database of the CAS, there's a process that kicks in to start replicating information down to the child primary software update points, right? And that's what these are. There was some illustration I was using about sharing the database between software update points when you have multiple whatever, but the point is we replicate it down to the child primary site's software update point, and then the data is ready, right? So there's a process for that, and files have to move and different things, right? But metadata has to move and so on. So I'm not going to get in the weeds on the actual replication process of that, except to just remind you of that flow, because we are moving data through the hierarchy. Here's some details about it. You can read through that if you want to. One point I want to call out, though, is that there are, just to remind you, two different kinds of synchronization that can happen. Right? There's a full synchronization. There's a delta synchronization. Those generally are managed by the site server. You can't really choose which kind of synchronization of software updates you want to use. Now, you can. There are ways to influence it, but most synchronizations are going to be a delta sync. What that means is anything that's changed, been added, removed from the software update list, we're going to manage during that delta synchronization of updates. But then there's the full synchronization, which means we're going to redo the whole thing, right? So that's a scenario that can be triggered by a couple of things. Actually, there's a timing setting in the site control information that will allow kind of a countdown, and once we get past that timeout, we'll go ahead and do a full synchronization. Other things, if you change the supersedence rules, that's going to trigger a full update. If you change the categories, that's going to trigger a full update, right? So there are ways that you could actually get in there and manipulate and do a full update if you needed to. Generally not necessary. The system managing itself is fine, but there are ways to do it. So, and I wanted to take a minute and show you that. So in terms of triggering the synchronization, the typical way, let me pull that back in, my lab back in. The typical way that you would trigger a synchronization is either by running on a schedule. So under administration, my sites, again, just as a reminder, at my CAS, I can set up my software update point schedule for when I do synchronization up here. So that would trigger synchronization, or I can manually do it on my all software updates, right click and synchronize software updates. That's fine. all this is doing, so I could trigger it right here. I'm not going to because I don't have it running and I want to actually cause it to run here in a second. All I'm doing at this stage, whenever I trigger it, either by schedule or by manually triggering it, I'm actually dropping a flag file into the wsyncmanager.box. So one of the things that's pertinent about ConfigMgr, certainly more pertinent in ConfigMgr 2007, but it's still very pertinent in 2012 in various areas, is the concept of flag files. Sometimes those flag files are empty, such as in the case I'm going to show you now. Other times, those flag files actually contain data. So for those flag files that are empty, you can create them just like the system does. For those flag files that contain data, you can't really create those and have them be meaningful to the system, but at least it's interesting to know what processes actually work to cause those flag files to be created. So let me show you what I mean. So if I go into my site server, let me see which one I'm on. Here, actually, let me just go into it in DOS in my command prompt. Okay, so let me navigate to it. There we go, CD. There. So this is an inbox. So this is the wsyncmanager inbox. Well, what you're going to notice is I can trigger, there's actually those two kinds of synchronizations that I want to trigger. One would be the full synchronization, and the other would be the delta synchronization. So I'm looking for my wsyncmgr log. This has to be it, and I believe it's on the right location. It is. So this is my wsyncmgr log at the CAS. You notice it's idle right now, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wake it up, just the same thing as I would do in the console. So I'm just going to copy con. So this is going to go do a full sync, right? So I'm just going to create that in the directory, and you'll see that it's going to trigger a full sync. Or I could actually do what's called a self-sync, and that's going to trigger just a delta sync, right? But for this, I'll just do the full sync and drop it in there. Okay, so F6, enter, and we dropped it in. One file copied into this inbox, do a directory. It's right there. It's actually being processed right now. You'll see it, that we are doing a full sync after we realize that there is a file there, and the synchronization starting up, and do another directory. Now that file's gone. So pretty simple, right? But it illustrates a point that if you know the system and what different things cause different actions, in some cases anyway, you can actually intervene and take those actions yourself. Now, I'm not going to recommend that you sit here and do full syncs by dropping a file, but it's interesting because if you do have an issue with the consistency of your software updates, you think something might be wrong, it's easy enough to just go in here and drop this file and start off a full synchronization, and hopefully that will repair anything that's wrong in the software updates tables. That's an idea anyway, right? And there's some other places where that plays. We've been doing kind of parallel to this discussion. We started anyway a discussion on data replication in ConfigMgr 2012, kind of on purpose, because as you'll see, we'll talk a little bit about data replication here in a minute, and we'll definitely dive deeper into the way flag files move and so on through the inbox structure in terms of file-based data replication as we cover that part, right? So it's definitely, flag files are plenty in Configuration Manager. We won't cover all of them, but it's nice to know, again, how the system works, and that's just an example. And it's not a mystery. It's right here in the logs, too. So cool. So let's minimize this. All right, and roll on. So let me pull the lab back out for a minute and continue. All right. So in terms of hierarchies and software update movement and the replication process and how things work whenever we're actually creating these components, let's talk about that for a minute. So in terms of the components, the specific components of building a software update deployment, certainly you have the software updates themselves, the software update groups, but then you have the content, right? all of that information is going to fall into one of two categories. It's either going to be metadata or it's going to be source files. Well, you can probably figure out which is which, right? Software updates, software update groups, both are metadata. Metadata is replicated across a hierarchy using ConfigMgr SQL replication. So in the data replication series that we're doing, we're going to dive deeply into ConfigMgr SQL replication. So I'm not going to do that here. I'll touch a few points on it, but I'm not going to dive deeply on it here, except to tell you that there is a separation in the way data moves throughout the hierarchy when we're actually replicating. In terms of the content, that's going to go through, or the source files, that's going to go through file-based replication. Again, we're going to dive deeply into how file-based replication works in one of the data replication sessions. In fact, the one, part 2, I believe, is that we're about to schedule and do as of this recording anyway. And understanding that separation, how things move, is important. And it's also important to point out, this is not a configuration item specific thing, and at least a software update specific thing. This generally applies to any configuration item type, and moving metadata around could apply to a number of different things outside of configuration items, as you'll see as we talk about this more in the data replication series. Source file movement, the way that we transmit source files is not unique to software update source files. It applies to any source files, packages, applications, whatever, right, that we need to move around. Okay, so in terms of replication of data, there's two types that we'll talk about. There's intra-site, meaning the replication of data within the site. We're not, arguably that's really not replication of data, though there is movement of data around in a single site. And I'll show you that in a minute. But really, inter-site is where we're really talking about replication. Here's the point, and again, I'll show this to you live in just a minute. So in order to move data around in a hierarchy, there's a few things that have to take place. So let's just kind of break them down. And again, I'll show them to you again because I think it's important to kind of understand this and then see it happen live. So in terms of the metadata, again, within a single primary site, there is no hierarchy, so that's intra-site replication. Parts of this don't happen, right? But within a hierarchy, whenever you create software updates at the top level, the metadata is actually replicated down through ConfigMgr SQL replication, but there's some processing that happens within the site that has to take place to kind of prepare the software update data that you've configured and get all the pieces in place. Okay, so the insertion of the data, the work that you're doing in the console, actually causes information to be inserted into the database. That insertion into the database triggers some further action within a site. Also, whenever data is inserted into the database, it then becomes subject, at least in this case, to replication, and then is moved down to our child primary sites where that insertion again causes some activity within our primary site. Okay? When you configure the update and tell it to download the update and put it on a distribution point, that's going to cause the sending of data through the file-based mechanism to our child sites that have our distribution points. Right? So that's kind of the point. And I'll show it to you here in a minute, and it will actually make more sense to see it live, but that's kind of the primer. All right? So in terms of tracking replication, certainly the logs come into play. We have already looked at least at the WSync Manager log to be able to track replication. And then we'll go into the logs a little bit more in a minute. You can actually see some replication being tracked during a deployment that I'm going to kind of walk you through. But in the console here, we have the monitoring node, and you can certainly take a look at database replication here. So all of this metadata is going through database replication. It's a really good idea to keep an eye on whether the links are active, whether they aren't. If links are inactive, then replication either totally or partially is impaired, and some data may not make it. Now, is it going to affect software updates? Maybe not. It depends on which replication group or groups are actually affected. More on that in a minute. I'll show you some of the breakdown just in general. I'm not going to get deep into the details about it, but just how you can see what the replication groups are, and maybe start to think in those terms. That again, if that's interesting to you, tune into the data replication series where we go through all of that. All right, and then here for this, and then certainly the synchronization of updates, the WSUS sync is available here. You can tell I just kicked off WSUS synchronization, so it's in progress at my CAS. So you can definitely tell, whether we're actively synchronizing, whether there's problems, latest status, different things, and again the logs, which you'll see coming up actually next. So let me pull this out of the way, and it'll shortly be back in focus and talk about this. So in terms of deploying software updates, we think in terms of, again, either a single site or a hierarchy. Single site, everything's self-contained, as I mentioned. So certainly there's some movement of data. Some of the things, or the information I'm going to show you here in just a second, happens at a primary site, but it's all self-contained. In a hierarchy, we have to not only factor in the processing that happens within a site, but getting data from one site to another, right? So basically the scenario is that in a hierarchy, let's go on to this diagram. Again, there's two types of replication when we create data, when we create software updates. There's the ConfigMgr SQL replication shown in blue on the graphic, and there's the file-based replication shown in yellow. So whatever you do, whenever you're working in the console, you're actually working through a component called the SMS provider. The SMS provider receives all of mostly all of the console interactions and takes action upon it to create data in the database, make changes to data in the database, whatever, right? So let's just trace this down. So in terms of creating the software updates, the software update groups doing the deployment, what's happening is on the metadata side, ConfigMgr SQL replication sees the information that's been inserted into the database and goes ahead and replicates that down to our child sites at the pre-configured replication interval for the data type. So that's either going to be 1 or 5 minutes, right? And the configuration item detail is going to be every minute, and you'll see that again in a minute, where I kind of touch on some of that information. Then, once the replicated data is received by the child database and inserted, then there's a component called SMSDBmon that is watching the database. That component lives up here at the CAS as well. So if you create the data at the CAS, SMSDBmon sees that and triggers further processing. But in this case, just staying with it, SMSDBmon sees the insertion and triggers creation of policy for the client, which is where ultimately this discussion is trying to lead us. And that once that policy is created by policy provider, it's ready. The client can come fetch it, can come start to take action on the software updates that are there, right? So that's the end goal, is to create policy, and that's the process I want to show you and kind of walk through. Now, there's a little bit more processing that happens as a result of data replication, which I'll show you in the demo in just a sec. All right, and then on the file movement side, again, not getting too much off in the weeds here, but at the CAS, whenever you add software update content and deploy it to a distribution point, and also whenever you kind of assign that deployment to a collection, the deployment kind of more is on the metadata side, but still, whenever you assign that deployment to a collection, the content is in progress, it's going out, the clients will need to be able to access the content, right? Well, actually, how we move the content around at the CAS, there's a few components. Distribution manager comes into play. Replication manager, scheduler, and sender ultimately are involved to deploy the content to the downstream site server. Sender sends it down, right? On the primary site, there's components, despooler, replication manager, distribution manager, that receive and act on the content. Despooler receives it, unpacks it, hands it over to the various components, distribution manager, whatever, and the distribution manager, if it's a local distribution point, just copies it out, right? Or if it's a remote distribution point, hands it over to package transfer manager, which will then be responsible for moving it to the correct remote distribution points, right? So again, this flow I'm not really going to go into here. It will be a major discussion in, again, part 2 of the data replication series, but we'll save it for now. But I do want to show you this. So let me bring in the lab, no better way to show it than to actually demo it, and create a software update group and show you what happens, right? So in order to demonstrate that, I've got my log here. Let's make sure I have them synced up. I don't need my WSync manager log anymore. It's rolling. Okay. I do have a couple of logs here that I will use. So here's my policy provider log. So again, the ultimate goal of all of this is to create policy. So I'm going to lay out my policy provider log over here, a little bit off the screen so I can refer back to it. Then I have my SMSDBmon log. So this is, again, on the child side. So you can see by the UNC that I'm actually remotely accessing the child site's logs. So I can take a look at it. Let me just scroll down here all the way. And then we'll wait to see what happens. Well, my scrolling's taking too long. Let me just drag it down. Yeah, here we go. Cool. SMSDBmon is oftentimes a pretty busy log, so we'll kind of stack this on top. All right. And then there's another log here that I want to look at called OBJ REPL Manager. So this is actually at the CAS. So the reason I'm going to show you this, it's really not so much involved as kind of in your face as seeing the data move through SMSDBmon and policy provider, but it's important because whenever you actually insert data into the database, those are configuration items. You need to further process those configuration items to get things ready. Both the CAS will have to do that and the child primary will have to do that, right? So whenever you insert into the database, SMSDBmon will wake up and create some of the files needed for object for this log, object replication manager, and we'll see the processing. In fact, to show you that, let me just pull up one other log, which is the SMSDBmon, but this time on the CAS. So that's not it. Let me get rid of it, and let's get the CAS SMSDBmon log, and we'll kind of monitor it as well. So SMSDBmon, let's open it up, minimize this, and we'll kind of stack it over, crunch it down a bit, and then stack it over to the right side. In fact, this is moving pretty slowly right here because I'm synchronizing, so I'm just going to stop the executive and restart it and stop the synchronization and come back in. Okay, so I'm stopping the executive and it should be restarting behind the scenes. So I'll kind of pull my log over here and go ahead and get things set up while that's working. All right, and it should be restarting, so let me position this out. There we go. Crunch it down a bit more. So executive starting up. Okay, good. Now, so let me minimize this. Okay, here's the console. So what I want to do is I want to create a new software update group. Now, creating the new software update group, I don't really care which update it is. I just need at least one update to create the new update group. So let me just go into my existing update group and I'll create a new one based on the updates in this existing group. All right, so I'll just take the one at the top and create a new software update group. This is really all I need to do because I mentioned software update groups in and of themselves are configuration items. So this whole processing flow of configuration items needing to move the metadata anyway is going to be triggered whenever I create a software update group. The file-based stuff won't be triggered until I have content, which would be when I deploy the content for a software update to a distribution point, right? But in this case, all I care about is the replication of the metadata, so I'll just call this demo. All right, I'm going to create that. And again, let me minimize if I can this. We're kind of watching these logs. Let me pull this down and over a bit. So these logs are the ones we care about. SMSDBmon right now and ConfigMgr are the first two that we'll worry about. So let me kind of line these up best I can. Get this down here a little bit. All right. And whenever I hit go on this, there will be data inserted into the database, which will trigger processing at SMSDBmon, and then ultimately OBJ Manager, and we'll also see replication happen, and you'll see activity in this SMSDBmon log. And so you saw it. It just kicked off. So here are the CIN files, right here, just one, and you see the CIN processing down here. So we process the files. There we go, right? So now everything's processed on the CAS. Now we're just waiting for the replication to happen and show up down at the child primary site. Okay, so we'll see the SMSDBmon kick off. We will not see anything kick off yet at the child site in terms of policy, right? Because all we're doing is kicking off a new software update group. We're not actually assigning anything for deployment yet. In order to see something show up in policy provider, we'd have to deploy something. So let's just wait for a minute, and we'll see some activity as the replication happens and that software update group comes down here, and then we'll actually go do a deployment. And we just saw it. Here's SMSDBmon. Let me scroll down a little bit. So we see it, that same CIN, same number, 56600 CIN from here. It replicated down. SMSDBmon saw it and kicked in, right? So we didn't see any movement again in policy providers. So let's kind of reset the table. Let's move these over, and we'll actually go create a deployment and go see how that looks, right, in these logs. So I'll put these up top, and let's get the console back up. So I have now my software update group. I created my demo software update group. So let's just go click deploy, and we'll work through that. I'll just call this the demo deployment, and select my all systems collection, because I know there's machines down there I care about. Take the defaults. Doesn't really matter to me. And what I want to see is the movement. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this and hit next and let the processing start. Now we're watching this. Now you just saw it. It just started creating some things. So here's a new configuration item ID. We're going to see some processing as it arrives. In fact, it might have already done it. Let's see. Yeah, there's some additional processing. Right now this, so we saw it. This is nothing new. So I'm going to go ahead and close these out. Now we're waiting again for replication to take place, and this time it's configuration item information or configurations that actually result from a deployment. So we would expect to see down here, again, the timestamp is always your friend when you're looking at these logs. We would expect to see in policy provider, in fact here we just saw it. It just came down. So right here, and you just saw this pickup, right? So we saw this come down. Here's our CI information and so on. And then notice there's a little bit of processing, a CIA file, RBAC file, and a CIN file that are created by the process, right? And SMSDBmon drops those into these inboxes. But the one that we care about is policy provider, because policy provider is the one that goes out and creates policy for our clients. And we see right here that we've dropped a policy file, PAC, into the policy provider inbox. Well, we can easily track that to the policy provider processing right here, and we're going to handle, we're processing our collection change. Again, the timestamp is our friend. We start right about here. We've got an event triggered. Why? Because we dropped that flag file. We're looking for any collection changes and so on. We're processing our assignments. We are seeing the assignments. You should see it down a little bit more. Here's collection 2. 16 items are added because I just deployed there. There's 16 machines over in the all systems collection, as we can tell right here. 16, right? And then we just continue on processing, and basically we are assigning this deployment to the collection by simply dropping a policy file into that folder. So right, that's the ultimate end of where we want to be in this discussion, is having policy prepared for our clients to download. Well, one question that might come up here for those that have worked with ConfigMgr for a while is to say, wait a minute, isn't there a step or two that you're missing in between the process of this? Shouldn't you actually have something taking effect from Offer Manager? Right? Great question. Actually, Offer Manager doesn't play here. It's all handled by linking the collection to the deployment in the database. Okay, and this is a great segue to go start to talk about some of the tables in the database. Let me pull this up and we'll go look at it. Right. So before we get into the database is something that, again, it's very instructive to understand how things work, why they work that way, maybe, and have some insight. But the database is something that is something you should treat with kid gloves. Look at it, certainly. Use it for education, certainly. But don't modify data there. You can really get yourself into a lot of trouble if you modify something and you really shouldn't. There are times working with support that you'll need to modify some things in the database, but make sure you're working with support, because it's totally unsupported to modify the database on your own. Right? Okay. Disclaimer gone. Now let's look at a couple of places. So let's just pull the lab back in and take a look. So there's a number. So we talked a lot about configuration items, and there certainly are a number of configuration item related tables. So I'll pop up SQL here and we'll take a look. So if I scroll up just all the way to the top first, so I'm in the system tables, and I scroll down, there's a number of tables that start with CI for configuration item. Here's the first one. If I scroll down, you'll see there's quite a number. There's no way that I have time to go through all of them here, but it's interesting to take a look at a couple of these. So the first key table that's interesting is this one called CI underscore configuration items. All right. Now, if I do a query, let me show you. This is actually going to be a pretty significant sized table in most environments. In my lab, it's not going to be massive, but in most environments it will be. So if I just look, I'm going to have about 50,000 rows. Yeah, 53,000, right? The vast majority of these are going to be software updates. So if I go change this and just do a select star, then actually before I do that, so here's the first question, or a question. So knowing that the software updates are configuration items, and knowing that there are a number of other things that are configuration items too, because I told you and you trust me, how do you figure out which ones are configuration items for software updates and which ones are configuration items for other things? Well, that answer comes whenever we realize the different kinds of configuration items that are out there and what they're used for. So a good way to find that out is to do a select from CI underscore types. And this will list all of the different types of configuration items. So we know that a configuration item with a type ID of 1 is going to be a software update configuration item. We know that a configuration item with an ID of 9 is one of those authorization list configuration items. And then we have other things here like drivers, that's OSD, and baselines and different things for compliance settings, application CIs, and so on. So there's a good number of them. But what if I just want to look at a software update CI? Well, it's easy. I can just go from CI type, or sorry, where CI type ID equals 1. And you'll see that I'll run this, and there's about 47,000-ish in here. Looks like it's still running. There we go. 46,595. Right. So there's a lot of these. Again, the vast majority of these are software update configuration items. Okay. Now, so the CI unique ID is not, like I mentioned, going to look like the other CI unique ID, but this area that I mentioned in the console, if I go over to software updates, right here, software updates, and just look at it, the unique update ID, as soon as this opens up, here, let me add that back in. Oh, it's in there. Okay, let me scroll to the right. The unique update ID, this format is exactly the format you're looking at in the database, right? So I could probably go query some of these and find it, but I have a few at my fingertips here, so no reason. So here's the CI unique ID. And I can actually learn a lot about this. So I can see the version of the CI, the type of the CI, the version of the policy, when it was created, and different things about it, right, if I want to, and so on, right? What site defined it, whatever. One thing that's interesting about this, notice this SDM package digest. Well, what if you want to understand a little bit more about the details of deploying this particular software update? Well, SDM package digest means abbreviated, and that's certainly true here. If you want to see full detail about the data that I'm going to show you here in just a minute, you can actually find it elsewhere in the database. I won't go into it now. But the point is, if I click on this, it's going to give me a little bit of information about this particular software update. And notice this. So I mentioned that the unique ID right here doesn't really it's not really in the format of what I showed you to be a configuration item ID. But if you look over here in the definition, the package digest, you do see what would look like to be the kind of the format of a configuration item ID, just broken up without the backslash. So just right here, site underscore, and then sum. So sum means software update management. So we know that this is a software update that we're looking at, right? And again, the number corresponds to what we saw. So you don't really need this. Let me show you what I mean. So this D6949, whatever this long unique ID, if you look over here, it directly corresponds to what you see after the sum underscore. So you don't really need this tag to know that it's a configuration item. You can just look at the unique ID, no problem, right? But there's other stuff in here like the scan tool that we want to use for detection, right? And then there's a GUID for that. Then we have the command line, or here's the cab file in this case, and then the command line, right? Hash value, size information about it, and so on. So again, this is an abbreviated version of what you can find more detailed elsewhere in the database, but it's interesting, right, for sure. Well, what if I want to look at the authorization lists? So I remember from the CI types table that the authorization list is a type of 9, so I can go execute this thing, and I will see, here's the authorization lists. Right, so I can go and look at the SDM package digest as well, and look at this. I see the software update reference here. So if I were to go look inside this software update group, which is what we're looking at here, I would see these are the software updates that are in the software update group. Right? So maybe this is starting to make a little bit of sense about how all this fits together. Right? So which version of the CI? Again, this might be the same thing. Nope, there's actually, looks like there's not anything in this particular one. Let's see. That one's empty too. These probably are deleted that haven't actually gotten cleared yet. Let's see, are these Tombstone? Yep, these are Tombstone ones, right? So those are gone. So the only other one that's not Tombstoned is this one maybe? And yeah, it only has one software update in it, so that makes sense, right? Again, it helps to understand how all of this fits together. Okay? So, these are the software updates. You can see what software updates are and related to the console by the unique ID. You can see the authorization list and what software updates are in the authorization list in the console using the SDM package digest. But I also mentioned that software updates are directly assigned to a collection in the CI tables. Certainly you do it in the console. You deploy to a collection. That association is stored in the database, and then that's what we can act upon whenever policy provider goes to look at some things and tries to do the preparation of policy. So let's show you that real quick. So if I scroll up to the CI table, CI_CI assignments, right? That kind of looks suspicious as maybe a place that you would have assignments. So I'll do a select star from CI_CI assignments and see what that shows me. Did I do that wrong? CI_CI assignment, select star. Oops, yes, I did. I need a from statement. That would help. Okay, so here are my assignments. So you saw me create a demo software update group and assign that, deploy that, and I use the name demo in my deployment. So the assignment name is demo. It has a unique ID. It also has a target collection, which is 2. Now I can interpret these IDs. I know this one's all systems, so I don't have to, but I could if I wanted to. And then the different actions on the deployment that I can go into, right? So, okay, cool. So I know that I have this software update deployment. This software update group deployment is called demo, and it's assigned here. But what if I want to know what actual software updates are in this particular assignment? Well, that's not hard either. So we see the assignment ID, and there's another table in here that we can query called CI_CI assignment targeted CIs. Targeted CIs. Now let me look at that, see if I typed it wrong. CI assignment targeted CIs. I might have typed that wrong. Let's see. CI assignment targeted CIs. That's what I want. Good. Okay. Always let SQL autocomplete do it for you. So I'll run this, and we're looking for an assignment ID of 22. So I'll run that, and we see the assignment ID of 22. And we see in here the configuration item ID for that is 38881. Well, if you look at this, you can actually track that back to the console as well. Let me pull the console up and move over to software update groups. And you'll recall that I added in the CI_ID column. Oops, that's jumping ahead a little bit. One moment. So 38881, that's the CI ID. Sorry, I jumped ahead. So this is the configuration item ID that's in this particular assignment. Okay. Now let me go make another quick change for a minute. And here I have another software update group that is not deployed right now. Well, let me show you. This demo only has one software update in it, but this one has a number of software updates in it. So let's look at what happens here whenever I go to deploy this one. So all I care about is the database changes right now. So I'm going to go again, call this demo 2, so we should be able to see that in the database, and deploy it to all systems. Good enough. Just take all the defaults from here and hit go. Well, here in just a second, all of the database magic should have been done, so we'll go look back and see if it looks any different now. Okay, close. All right, so let me minimize this. And so now let's run our assignments and see what our assignment ID is. So I'm going to execute that. So demo 2 is assignment ID of 23. Well, now let's look at the CI assignment targeted CIs. Oops, let me get the whole thing. There. Now look at the difference. So before we had the ID of 22 and it mapped to a CI of 38881, a CI ID, right? Which I'll loop back to that in just a second. But that was when I just had one software update. Now I have a bunch of them. So look, for the assignment ID of 23, I'm tracking every single software update by CI ID that is out there to be deployed. Well, if you'll remember, CI ID is a column on this table. So if I want to map back to exactly what CI this particular one is, let me show you. Stop, execute. So if I want to see what CI 38881 is, for example, I can go in here and hone in on it specifically. Here it is, 3881, and then I click on this and I know it's this particular software update. Where is it? Right up here somewhere. This one, right up here, .NET Framework update, right? So hopefully you're getting the sense that this is actually useful information. There's a lot more here. I just don't have time to show you, but you get the idea, hopefully, right? Well, that's one. Those are the CI tables. Well, I mentioned a couple more. There's policy tables. So the policy is where we ultimately want to get to the clients. Now, policy tables are not unique to software updates, but there are a grouping of them. You can actually interpret these not similar, but along the same lines as you can the CI tables. There's policy assignments, There's policy collection mappings and so on, right? But that's for any kind of policy. Policy is always targeted to clients and oftentimes targeted to collections, and you can see all that and be able to map it through. Now, it's difficult to reverse engineer in here. In fact, you really can't practically reverse engineer and figure out what a policy body contains, but at least it's interesting. You can track it up until this point and make sure that policy is actually getting created for your clients. All right. Then we have some compliance status tables. Now, I'm looking at tables right now. I'm going to collapse this because really views are what we should be looking at, especially whenever we look at status. Because why would you care to look at status? You generally care to look at status because you're interested in understanding compliance of particular software updates. So I'm jumping ahead now to talk a little bit about compliance and status and different things, right? So there are some update deployment status tables. So you see them throughout, like v_update compliance status and different things. So there's a number of tables you can tap into, or views that you can tap into. The question is, why use views instead of tables? Well, the answer is kind of two-part. One, views are guaranteed to stay consistent throughout the various iterations of a product. So as long as it's ConfigMgr 2012, whether it's RTM or Service Pack 1 or R2 or whatever it is, the views are engineered to be maintained and usable. So if you build your reports on views, you won't have to worry about generally re-engineering those reports. Another thing is views kind of pull together data that might be abstracted across a bunch of different tables and make it easier to digest, easier to query against. If you want to see the mechanics and what tables a particular view pulls from, you can easily see that. And you can see this one is kind of a view that joins in a couple of different tables. Right? There's an outer join, there's another outer join, here's the key table. So it just makes it easier to be able to find your information. There's also some update compliance information down here. So there's some views that start with v_, and then there's others that are just v, and then no underscore, and then there's other stuff here. So if you don't see what you're looking for under the v_, look in the v without an underscore, and you can see some update compliance summary detail here. All right. Okay. So enough about the database, and I have another slide just to kind of talk about software update status. I won't talk about it here. I'll just go into the console and talk about it. So in terms of software update status, it's always easy to go into the console and see the individual software update status. Just by clicking on a software update here or an update group, you can tell how many software updates are required, what percentage are compliant. And so on, right? If you look at an individual software update in the chart, let me just reverse this here. Come on. Let me go into the software update group here. So if I click on an individual software update, I get a real quick, easy to read glance at what the compliance overall for that particular software update is, right? So that's easy. That doesn't change. It's just the software update is always going to be the software update. As long as it's in the database, it's going to show compliance status, right? Well, then we have the software update group itself. So the software update group, as I mentioned, is going to show you compliance status for the group overall, right? So this is a reminder. So whenever you are doing your regular maintenance and you want to change updates from one software update group and move them to another or retire them or whatever, this is where you're going to see things move from reading compliant, non-compliant, whatever, to unknown. Well, that may be alarming at first. If you don't expect it, for sure, you think something's wrong, right? But it's perfectly normal because of what I described earlier. I wish it wasn't this way, and there may be some ways to make it not be this way, but for now, this is the way it is. That whenever you make a change to a software update group, it essentially resets the table on that particular configuration item. The whole configuration item has to be evaluated again, and that's when we start to see the detail come back into the console and reset itself and be correct, right? So just want to mention that again. I mentioned it before. Here you can actually see it and know what's going on, right? You should still do maintenance. One knee jerk may be, well, I don't want that to happen, so I'm not going to do maintenance. That you really need to. do maintenance. So don't let that dissuade you from doing it or discourage you from doing it. Just know what's going to happen. The actual updates themselves, the compliance on the updates themselves, isn't affected. It's just here, right? And that this should correct itself after, again, the evaluation happens again. All right. Also, another thing that will happen is under software updates. So there will be a period where you will have summarization. So you can actually summarize the results here. So summarization just basically means that you're re-summarizing the results of all of these software update groups throughout the hierarchy. And that can take a little bit of time. It's something that happens on its own. You can kick it off here if you want to, but that's just another way to get data refreshed. It's not an immediate thing, but it will happen. All right, and then the other thing I'll just show you as we kind of wrap up is under the monitoring node. So under deployments, you can monitor all kinds of deployments. Every deployment type of deployment that you would do, you can monitor here. And certainly software updates. So if I want to look at my deployment, I haven't had these out here in the environment long enough to really show compliance, but the beautiful thing about this is if you're doing a deployment and you want to view detail about what machines are in a given state, either compliant, in progress, error, unknown, whatever, you can look in here and we'll actually read out the machines, give you detail about why the machines maybe are in an error state or whatever, and it's very useful information, right? So cool. So that kind of walks us through the detail of software updates behind the scenes. Again, the part I've left out behind the scenes is actually the metadata replication, the content replication, because that's going to be handled in a discussion for data replication specifically to deal with that. And because it's not specific to software updates, I didn't cover it here. But it is important to understand how that works, and we'll pull the covers back on that in the data replication series. So that concludes part 3. Part 4 starts to turn our attention to the client side, and we'll just kind of talk about general client-side experience, deploying software updates, and so on. Part 5 will go deep dive into how to trace software updates on the client and how different things work. So we'll conclude for now, and we'll see you in part 4.